from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
Welcome to today's program. I'm very pleased to welcome to the program a friend of mine that I've known for a number of years, Bea Peterson, and we're going to discuss a variety of subjects. She has a really wealth of experience, what I would describe as a political activist, particularly working in the field of human rights. She's also a journalist, so she has much wisdom that she can bring to our program. Our guest comes to us from North Dakota, where she had most of her experience. She now resides in Idaho. Bea Peterson is the former chair of the North Dakota Human Rights Commission. She's also a former member of the North Dakota Advisory Committee of the United States Commission on Civil Rights, and she also is the former National Committee woman for the Democratic Party from North Dakota. Bea, it's a pleasure having you on the program, and we're going to talk about some of those experiences, and particularly an issue that dealt with a murder trial in North Dakota and how you had a role to play in observing the procedures for that issue. First of all, let us start with an early period of time in which you got involved in your early career as a journalist and also in the political arena.
Oh, well, as a journalist, I started probably in my 20s, and I started with weeklies, then dailies, then went on, and then as television came in, went into television and weeklies and dailies, and it was just a lot of fun.
So you have been involved both in the print media and the live media.
I had my own television program several different times, several different ways, and some of them were, to begin with, when I first became involved, it was in fundraising for people who were ill or were in need, and then it just went from there. The Dickinson State College now it's university, of course, but at that time we held most of our meetings there because we had a lot more room. But the television stations that we had in Dickinson I started with radio first, and then I started with television. And then I was invited to be on programs around the state, and it was fun. You're just like you're talking to your neighbors, which you really are, you know.
So you've done television, radio, and newspapers, so very few journalists have that kind of broad brush approach to journalism and communication.
I find it's quite a challenge.
Yes. Is there any particular part of journalism that you did that was most rewarding to you or most challenging?
Well, I would say the one that had to do with civil rights and anything to do with people in that particular category. I thought that was probably the most productive because in North Dakota, to begin with, we didn't have a civil rights organization. And then as it became established on the national level, then they went into a different type of thing where they had 8 different divisions in the United States. And so we were in number 8 of that group. It was fun.
Let's talk a little bit about that as you moved into the activist role itself. Reporting on issues such as human rights is very different than being an activist
Indeed.
itself and developing public policy. When you became a member of the North Dakota Advisory Committee of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, indicate some of the things that your advisory group looked at or did, and what you came away with as far as the needs.
Well, one of the major advances that we came up with, at least I call them advances because we did make progress, was in housing in Bismarck, in the city of Bismarck. And we set up a big workshop, and we invited certain businessmen. Some of them weren't too happy to come, but they did. And it was quite interesting, and also it was very revealing because we worked quite closely with the governors in each case, and they were very interested. And we, in the first major one that we did, we also put out a book about that thick that explained what had happened, and it was very obvious that it was very tough for some of the Indian people to get housing. And one of the major ways when they argued with us, for instance, when one of the businessmen said, "Well, that just isn't possible. No one around here is going to deny anyone a house or an apartment." And we did have some Indian people there who were able to say that when we knocked on the door, they welcomed us in until they saw the color of our skin, and immediately lost interest in, just said, "We have no room." No room at the inn, so to speak.
Yes. So there's been this long pattern of housing discrimination, particularly to individuals of color and minorities.
True.
With what you found out and by holding those workshops and hearings and so forth, did you have a breakthrough to where you were able to break? I know we have federal laws governing discrimination, housing, and jobs. Did you make progress in North Dakota?
Yes, we did. We certainly did in Bismarck, because the businessmen held some meetings of their own, and then of course the other thing was through the legislative process, and not only just through the process itself, but in appearing and speaking to them of the experiences and the things that were happening. And again, of course, you get some that argue and some that don't, but at least they were interested and they followed through. And once in a while we had an interesting one, like for instance, if I can may I do this? Well, in Watford City, which is not a very large city, the lady that was in charge of the human rights work up there and was also an attorney came out of her apartment and stepped out into the street, and an Indian gentleman, an old-timer who was driving a pretty rickety truck, literally crashed into her. He didn't hurt her, but he came against her, and so she said, "You know, I could really take you to court on that." And he said, "But it was such a little truck." So, and of course no one did anything, but that was a very unusual thing, but it was, everyone got a kick out of it, including the Indian people themselves. Also, they began to be involved with their own radio and things. We worked with them when we could.
When you were on the state Human Rights Commission, which is at the state level, the other one had been federally related, or the national government, and you, after a period of time, became chair of the State Human Rights Commission, did you have any state laws that were helpful to you, or how much were you in an advisory role? How much did you have any ability to exercise power in cases where you found discrimination?
Well, we were able to call meetings, legislative meetings and other types of meetings in the Capitol, and have people come in and testify and to speak and feel free to do so. And we did. It wasn't that there was not a big gap as far as whether you were Indian or white, because many of our friends that worked in main offices in the Capitol were Indian. And we tried to keep a real good balance there. But on the national, that was a different story.
When you refer to North Dakota, and we're talking about trying to promote civil rights in the form of legislation, public policy, some states have a very heavy African-American population, some states it would be Hispanic and so forth. But in North Dakota, when you deal with minority issues and civil rights, you're most likely dealing with Native Americans.
Yes, almost entirely.
Because other minority populations are very, very tiny in the state. I would like to get into a particular case because you had an important role as an observer in this situation. Many people have heard of the famous trial that took place, I believe, in 1978. It had to do with the murder of 2 FBI agents in North Dakota. And after some investigation, and there's all kinds of complexities to this whole case and individuals that could have possibly been involved, but it was alleged, and then there was a trial, that American Indian movement activist Leonard Peltier was charged with a crime and was convicted. And as time passed and different groups in America got involved in this, some contended that they felt the evidence was inadequate for the conviction, and others that were in the prosecutorial role said no, that there was sufficient evidence and the verdict was in. Would you take us through that important story. I know there's a book that's come out in relation to this, and other things that in film. After some years passed with this growing concern, was the case reopened, and what role did you play? I believe at that time you were on the advisory committee of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights.
As observer only, and strictly within bounds, so that...
Could I interrupt to say,
sure.
Before we even get into your advisory role, or not advisory role, but observing, was there the court ordered a rehearing,
yes.
Look into whether there should be a new trial or not? Mm-hmm. And that hearing was held where in North Dakota?
In Bismarck.
In Bismarck.
In the Capitol, in the Federal Building.
Okay.
With great big dogs all over the tops of the building, and you wouldn't believe.
It received a lot of attention.
Yes, it did.
Okay. Now take us through, I believe you and one other person were appointed to observe, and tell us how that process worked, that you were selected, both of you, and then what you did during the hearing itself.
Well, the two of us selected from North Dakota did not serve. I was the only one that served. The other one couldn't. She had other responsibilities and found she couldn't serve. But we did have, I forget what the name of that group is that always sends people, what is that one again? I'm trying to think of.
Amnesty International,
yes,
I believe.
Yes. There was a gentleman there from Amnesty International, and I was very disappointed in him for several reasons. For one, I couldn't fault him. He had a very severe cold, but he acted like he was extremely bored. He didn't seem to be... now, we were allowed to take notes only for the people that we were to give them to.
I just want to get through that. It's such a complicated story. So you were in the courtroom, and each one had been selected. Amnesty International chose a representative to be there to observe the hearing. You had been chosen from the advisory committee of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Were there other observers from other organizations?
No, there were not others permitted.
Just those two individuals?
We two were the only ones allowed.
The third person was chosen but couldn't come.
Yeah, so she
But she was from the advisory committee also?
Yes.
So it wound up being you two?
Yes.
Okay. When the hearing took place, how long did it last?
A long time. It started first thing in the morning, very early in the morning, about 8 or 9, I guess. I say early because I had to drive 100 miles to get there. But when it began in a very slow pace, and the judge was a very quiet judge. Benson was the judge.
Now, I'll interrupt again because there's so many details. This was not a trial, and there was not a jury. It was a judge holding a hearing whether they should order a new trial or not. Is that correct?
That was correct.
Okay, go ahead then.
And then the gentleman from Washington, D.C., Crooks, who was a prosecutor, was extremely, I don't know what type of word to use. He was just really cruel, and his attitude was very arrogant. And there were some really interesting things that came out, but he literally crushed them.
So he was representing the government to argue against a new trial.
And this other, the judge had also conducted the first trial in Fargo.
So
the
he
same
was
judge.
The same judge. Okay.
So he knew the case backwards and forwards, and he was fine. He was very considerate and quite gentle, and didn't. But the other one, Crooks, was extremely arrogant, and everyone, well, quite a few people that were watching, and there were not a lot of people allowed in, probably 20 at the most, and each one had to be totally cleared in order to come in and have their names down, and they were under guard, so to speak.
And then there were attorneys representing Mr. Leonard Peltier to argue for a new trial.
The same one, he always has counselor. He was there.
He was there arguing.
And he did a good job.
Then so this argument, of course, and presentation on both sides why there should or should not be a new trial took place. You say it started that morning. Did it last more than one day, or was it a full?
It was 2 days, about 2.5 days. But actually, there was another side to this. It wasn't just to know whether they should have a new trial as such. They also, there was a real question there about the bullets. Their bullets that were used, this is why Kunstler was able to get the trial held again. I mean, to have the same hearing held again. And I thought that every time that was brought up, and it was very clear to me, sitting where I was sitting, and I was quite close, it was very clear to me that those bullets were not the same. The bullets that were in the trunk of the car and the bullets that were over on another side were not the same. So someone else had to be involved.
When we talk about bullets, and it's like political assassinations, the argument about the assassination of President Kennedy, there's again the bullet theory involved.
Yeah.
Were they examining the bullets in relation
Yes,
to the bullets that were in the bodies of the FBI agents?
Yes.
How many places were there bullets? There were obviously the bullets that killed the agents, but there were bullets in the car. Were there bullets that were anywhere else?
I think there were only those in the car that they specifically handled, but they referred to other bullets. And several times Kunstler brought it up again because it was squashed. And I wasn't a bit satisfied with that part of it, because they did not follow through on that situation.
From your observing,
from my observance,
and hearing the arguments in court,
right.
Are you convinced that there was more than one gun involved and bullets from different guns?
Oh, definitely. I thought so, yes.
But Mr. Peltier was the only one that was convicted of the killings?
Yes, and I'm not at all sure that he was the one that had shot either bullet, either gun. You know, there were. It was kind of a strange situation. I was not happy with the trial when it finished. I felt it when
or the hearing.
The hearing, I meant to say, and I put all that in my report, which those could not be publicized, of course.
So you gave a report to the court or the commission?
I put the one, not the state commission, but the one. You see, at that time we had in the United States they had 8 organizations,
right.
And we were one of the 8.
Right.
And the director for our group was Bill Monroe, and his office was in Denver.
And so you reported to him?
So I reported to Bill, and then Bill sent his on to Washington, D.C.
to the commission office.
Mm-hmm.
And then the gentleman that represented Amnesty International, of course, went back and gave his report.
I have no idea what he did. He didn't seem to want to be there. He didn't seem to be interested. I'm assuming that he did his job. I don't know.
At that time, you couldn't talk about it publicly.
No, not at all.
Your report was written and was confidential, but now you can discuss
Yes.
the report. Can you give our viewers some idea of what you said in your report?
Yes, I think I can at this point. I certainly emphasized I was quite vehement about the fact that I thought the description and discussion about the bullets were dropped too soon, that they did not go into it. And even though the attorney tried, and several of the others that he conferred with tried to stay on that one track, and this attorney from Washington, D.C. he had also, I think, been at one of the other hearings. But he was he was rude. He was really rude, and he acted like he didn't hear, and he just went right over the top.
But it sounds like you put in your report that at the hearing, which was a hearing about the original
right.
trial, were you not satisfied that the court or the jury heard adequate evidence about the theories of the bullets?
I was not satisfied with it.
Was there some information that the defense counsel tried to put in the original trial about the bullets that didn't get into the trial?
They didn't. You see, that was one of the reasons why they had this, is because for the first time they came out in the open about the fact that there were differences in the bullets. And one, for instance, had a much sharper point, and the one was a little larger than the other. Some were found in the back, the trunk of one of the cars, and they were just, it was handled a lot differently than. I kept thinking, well, now, why don't they let them follow through so we know exactly what's going on here? But in each case, it seemed to me that the prosecutor deliberately tried to change it. And also, he was extremely sarcastic.
In the hearing itself, that followed the years after the trial, are you saying that in the hearing itself there wasn't even a thorough discussion of the bullet
That's
theories.
correct.
Just like there had not been in the original trial.
Correct.
If the original jury had heard the full story of this theory, do you think that, of course it's hard to guess what
Yeah.
others would do, but do you think that it would really made it much more difficult to have got a conviction?
I think it would have, and of course I think that was one of the reasons that the counselor was so extremely angry all the way through.
Defense counsel.
Yeah, because it was like he was just very autocratic, and
Oh,
he
I'm
was
sorry.
just-
I'm sorry.
I didn't mean the defense. No,
The
I'm
prosecution.
Sorry. Yeah, on the other side, yes, they were explaining, and they were doing it very carefully. They were speaking to the judge. And just like that, the other man would come through and wouldn't even let him finish their
He would
sentences.
object to
Yes.
the process. In your report, was there anything else other than the bullet theory that you reported that gave you concern about the trial
Well,
and the hearing itself?
again, this is my own personal feeling about the trial. I felt, from what I saw of Leonard Peltier and what I had read over the years as it went along, to me, he seemed a very gentle, quiet man. And I did meet his wife and his children afterwards very briefly. I wasn't allowed to talk to them, but I did shake hands with them. And he didn't look a violent person.
He was at the hearing, Mr. Peltier.
Yes, yes.
Did he testify at the hearing?
He was not allowed to speak. They didn't. Counselor wanted to have him have an opportunity, but he was not allowed to speak.
But I hear you saying then that, again, you're an observer and you don't, you're not a jury, but that his demeanor and his approach even created more doubts in your mind about the
Right.
possibility of his being guilty.
That's right.
Okay. In addition to that, was there anything else that you observed during those 2 days that you put in your report, other than the bullet theory and his demeanor and personality?
Well, one of the things that bothered me was it seemed to me that the other observer was not interested. He didn't seem to be. I was taking notes and I was listening and watching, and he didn't seem to be. And maybe that's not fair, but he didn't seem to be listening. I didn't see him taking any notes.
So, did you feel?
I felt like I was alone.
That's what I was just going to ask. The very words I was going to
put it that way. I felt like I was alone, and of course, as a member of the press, we were allowed to go out for lunch, and of course, a lot of my friends were saying, waving over here, and I said, "No, you know better than that." So okay, so they didn't really bother me, but
so you were there alone with your thoughts,
yeah.
alone with your notes, and the burden was all on you to
I
give
felt
only
it
report.
was. I felt it was. Yeah.
Okay. I have also, now that we've looked at that, is there anything else before we finish this that puts another doubt in your mind or gives you concern about the whole process in this particular case?
Well, of course, like I say, I'm hung up on that business about the bullets, and I certainly am very disgusted with the prosecutor from Washington, D.C., and I also feel I don't know for sure, but I wonder if when those notes got to Washington, if they were even looked at.
Did you ever hear back any report about it?
Never. And of course, as far as Bill was concerned, he wouldn't be able to do that unless they specifically sent something back.
That was the director of this region.
But at that time, it was Pendleton, Clarence Pendleton, I think his name was, and he was never interested in what we were doing. I never could figure out why he was chair of the Civil Rights Commission in the first place.
In wrapping this up, or conclusion to this part, with a couple other questions on something else we want to ask. This was really very personal, very sobering experience for you, and I suppose you continue to take that with you and to be concerned and wonder what will happen with this case.
That's why when I first came, I think it was the second night or third night maybe that I was here, you held a meeting in the school and I was there. And I looked around the room and I saw several people there that I wondered about, and it was interesting. One gentleman was to my left, and I found out afterwards I had already figured out that he was an FBI man. I mean, there's something about this that you get used to see.
Well, in the West, there's been a lot of hate groups, and in the Northwest, the FBI has done an outstanding job in investigating hate crimes like Order 1 and Order 2.
Yeah, I wasn't against
No,
him, you understand.
yeah.
I just recognized by his actions.
But even though there's outstanding work done, there can also be a mistake made, and that's what you're concerned about here. Of course, law enforcement people only present evidence, and it's the prosecutors that have to decide to use it or whether to prosecute. I do want to get in one other area with you, and that was really fascinating going through that process with you and the experience you had. I mentioned at the beginning of the show that you also were, at one time, was the National Committee Woman of the Democratic Party. What period was that when you were?
From 72 until I didn't run again in 1985.
So you had a long
12
period.
12 years.
And you were there during the Carter years and the Carter
Indeed,
administration.
I was there right from the beginning. As a matter of fact, the day that they had a break-in in the Democratic office, I was there that morning in that same room. And so I could visualize very easily, because I remember one of the things I saw when I walked across to the desk was someone had dropped a cigarette and there was a burn. You know, isn't it funny the things you think about?
The little details. But you did get to meet and become somewhat acquainted with President Carter and Rosalind Carter.
Oh, yes, got to know them really well. But prior to that, you see, when I was elected, that was in 72, and our meeting was held, our convention was held in Miami. And that was the time when, of course, we didn't know what in the world was happening. We had, let's see, Hubert Humphrey had a breakfast scheduled for all of his people, whoever wanted to support him. This was the beginning of the convention. And so I went in early to be seated there. I'd known Hubert
We're just
Humphrey.
out of time. I'm sorry, but you at least...
But we knew them all, and there they were. They were crying in the aisles. They were you know.
Yeah. And who did you support at the convention that year?
Well, I went from one to the other, because first I supported Humphrey, and then they drew him out. That was through those letters.
I have to interrupt there. We'll have to leave it there and let people wonder about what else happened at the convention. B. Peterson, thank you for being on our program. Appreciate it very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you found this most interesting, and I'd like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time, when we shall discuss what we believe to be a significant issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.